Thank you all for coming out on this very cold night, but what better to do on a cold night than to talk about science fiction? So, my name is Eric Yankee, and I serve as the acting dean of the College of Letters and Science, and my job is purely ceremonial. I'm going to get out of the way. Our speaker tonight is Professor David Bary, and he finished up his PhD at the University of Western Michigan University in 2012, and he joined our faculty in 2013. He's a sociologist, and he obviously wanted to talk about something fun. So I'll let David take it from there.
All right. Thank you. Welcome again. It's a very cold, cold night, and I thought we would just watch an episode of Star Trek for 45 minutes and then just talk about it. No, I'm kidding. We'll have some good content here. So maybe a little bit about myself. As I was introduced, I am classically trained in sociology with special interests in the sociology of religion and globalization and nationalism. And some of that will kind of peek out here and there with some of the examples that I have for us today. But actually, this is really my time to kind of geek out because I get to bring into the mix two of my foremost loves beyond my kids, which is science fiction and then my work in sociology. So I thought we would start off with a quick game, or a quick, let's call it a game here, and we'll see how much we know about science fiction and kind of the application in practice too. So let's start off with the real here. Anyone take a stab at what we're looking at? The International Space Station. Great. That is a real thing. What about here? Star Trek. Not Star Trek. There you go. I have nothing to give you, but good job. So 2001: A Space Odyssey is a film by Stanley Kubrick, 1967, and which was very heavily influencing popular culture at the time, not just in kind of the genre of science fiction, but also in science, in the natural sciences as well, and in engineering. In fact, a few decades later, when the team that would eventually build and design the International Space Station by 1998, pointed to 2001 as kind of a precursor to really generating some design ideas and kind of generating or engineering know-how for how to really put this into reality. And one example of that, there's a pretty famous scene in the film where one of the astronauts is jogging through the station, and that was heavily inspiring to the NASA engineers to develop something very similar. Surrey Williams here ran the Boston Marathon in 2007 on a treadmill. So this connection between science fiction and science, and of course today we're going to be focusing a lot more on the social sciences, has a precedent and is very powerful and comes out in a lot of different ways. So I thought we'd spend the better part of the hour today talking a little bit about that, and we'll reference some sources, some movies and film, some TV and novels that I think a lot of us are familiar with, but maybe some slightly more obscure ones as well. So just to kind of organize some thoughts here, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the historical precedents of this merging and conflation of the social sciences and science fiction, because this is not a new area. This has been going on for the better part of our discipline. So about 200 years or so. And then we can dive more into some of the applications into the generating of our ideas and concepts that we use in sociology and beyond, and also in practice as well. And it's all over the place, right? We live in a really kind of exciting time if you are a nerd, like I think most of us. Otherwise, why would you be here except for some extra credit, right? It's an exciting time because science fiction and fantasy and all of its other subgenres are more or less kind of infiltrating our popular culture. It's kind of everywhere. At a time, maybe 30, 40 years ago, this was seriously niche genres that you had to look out for. Today, you can find it everywhere. And There's a lot of really bad stuff, but there's a lot of really good stuff too, and so we'll focus on that. I think we're all familiar with the Twilight Zone. Maybe a lot of us are familiar with Black Mirror, which is kind of the modern day application of the same idea. Of course, there is now a readaptation of the early Twilight Zone into its own show, kind of a reawakening of the older model. But the idea of using science fiction, of speculative fiction, and beyond to say something about our society and our culture today and where we're headed has been around for a long time. So we'll get started with a couple of guiding questions here. And this is really the foundation of what sociology especially is all about. And so I'd like us to just maybe rest on these three ideas, these three questions as we go through some of the examples tonight. The first, kind of at the forefront of our questions, of our science, of our work, is how we build our world, both the social and physical world, to say something about who we are as humans and how we operate and interact with one another. The second is how we engage with that built environment, how we engage with the social structures that we create too, from politics to religion and beyond. So that level of engagement is really important. And then finally, that creation and development of identity, that sense of self, and how we build that world, engage within it, and how that directly creates a sense of who we are and how we interact with others. So a lot of the examples that we'll talk about today and explore will really be attempts to maybe answer and play around with some of these really core questions in the social sciences. So let's play around with a couple of examples. Like I said, the idea that science fiction and sociology and the social sciences are indeed wedded together is not new. In fact, that idea has been around since arguably the dawn of sociology about 200 plus years ago. And I'm just going to point to two or three examples so that we don't so I don't bore you too much, and then we'll contemporize it into what we're doing today. The first I'd point to is Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, pictured here, was working as a trained sociologist during the end of the 19th century, and a lot of her work focused specifically on gender and work and gender and marriage. And she was one of the very first to explore ideas like gender as a social construct. In other words, gender is something that can be very fluid, and its definitions can change from one culture to another culture, from one time period to another time period. She's noted for making this quote: women have economic value in society. They have some sort of independence, but it's akin to horses, meaning their work, or their worth rather, in society is no different than other commodities that are arguably used by men for the pursuit of more and more wealth and more power directed by men. And so she explored a lot of ideas related to the power differentials between men and women, both in the home and at work and in kind of the larger public, the larger society. So again, some context here. She's writing during the end of the 19th, early 20th century. Do you think she's quite popular in academic circles? Absolutely not. Much of her work was extremely marginalized because of being an educated woman. Some of her stuff was published in acceptable academic journals and publishers, but it wasn't until the 1980s, really, that Gilman was really acknowledged for her contributions to the field, some of her ideas predating her male counterparts by nearly 100 years, but because of her status of woman was largely ignored. However, she was also a fairly popular science fiction writer. And so during the same time that she was doing all of this great sociology stuff on gender and work and inequality, she was also writing some science fiction. Is anyone familiar with Herland? Sometimes that's because you took my class. No, I'm just kidding. Herland is a novel, or a novella really, that she developed during the same time that she was working on all of her academic contributions, and she was quite popularized, and this work was quite popularized at the time. So Herland, in so many words, envisions this kind of utopian society of only women, And there's a team of explorers, somewhat hilariously. These are male sociology students, so she was kind of taking a jab at her own discipline. These were male sociology students that quote unquote discovered this utopian society. And then the novel plays out with some of the interactions between the explorers and the inhabitants of her land. And here's just a brief description of some of the interplay between the explorers and some of the leaders of her land for you to read out. So as you can see, some of the dialogue really plays around with the assumptions and the expectations that we might have about gender and gender roles. In other words, the behaviors that we assume that men should exhibit, that women should exhibit, what role or status they should have in society, their place with work and so forth, and how, and really questions the kind of absoluteness of gender and gender roles into something that's a lot more fluid. And again, this predates a lot of what we would now acknowledge in sociology, and indeed a lot of the social sciences, by about 100 years. So she's doing this through this kind of popular prose, through fiction, as a way to get to some pretty profound ideas in society and culture. And she's using science fiction as a tool. She's using science fiction as a mechanism. And so this will be a really important theme for early sociology that I'll speak on in just a moment. The second example that I have for us comes at around the same time period, also in the United States, with W.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois is an American sociologist writing primarily in the early 20th century and beyond. Again, largely marginalized for being a person of color. But would eventually be acknowledged for contributing quite significantly to how we now characterize race or understand race, again, as a social construction. So very similar to what Gilman was doing with her work on gender and the role of women in society, Du Bois was doing something very similar for people of color. And so a large contribution to this idea of race as largely being rooted into the specific culture and the specific time period that can have differing definitions and not something that is biological purely or absolutely. And one of his most referenced concepts is this idea of two-ness or double consciousness, which he argues is a characteristic shared by almost any member of a marginalized or oppressed group or people. And of course, he's looking at African Americans as an example of this. But the premise or the idea of two-ness is simply that members of a marginalized group can be both welcomed into that larger community, but also exiled as well. In other words, not truly allowed to participate as a pure member of that particular society. So there's a pretty popular quote that gets to the heart of this idea of two-ness. Whenever he feels his two-ness, or this difference between being an American on the one hand and being black on the other, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So you can get this sense that there is, psychologically speaking, emotionally speaking, the development of these two warring identities that are occurring within one person, within one body. And of course, this idea of two-ness that was first developed 100 years ago, largely ignored and marginalized for the better part of the 20th century, and then brought back by the end of the 20th century, is being used all the time in the social sciences to understand some of the mental and emotional health considerations for members of a marginalized group. And this is a really important construct for us today. But again, marginalized, similar with Gilman. And like Gilman, Du Bois also dabbled a bit in science fiction too. The Comet was a short story that he wrote around the same time with much of the same mission that Gilman had with Herland, which was to create something that was accessible to the wider public. Knowing that his sociology work, his academic work, would maybe be utilized in some circles, but certainly not in the larger community, and definitely not within the entirety of the public or in the entirety of society. He used his work of fiction and science fiction as a way to tackle that gap. And The Comet is basically a brief novella that looks kind of what we would consider dystopian science today, or dystopian fiction rather, today. The premise is this natural disaster occurs, this comet lands on Earth, wipes out pretty much everyone, leaving 2 people to survive. 1 African-American male and a poor African-American male, and 1 wealthy white woman. And the 2 of them, and so the story follows them coming together to basically survive the aftermath. And as they work together and get to know one another, some of those social constructs of sex and race and class start to kind of push away because of the similarities of the predicament that they're in. So the story, again, contributes to this idea that all of these things that we assume are rooted in these absolutes, like class and race and sex and so forth, are truly byproducts of the culture and the situation that we're in. On a slightly pessimistic note, the story ends with the 2 of them finding her family, and she immediately leaves him behind so that she can join her affluent white family. And so he really calls into question how entrenched and how embedded some of those constructs truly are in our society. So I bring these 2 examples up because 1, we've been doing this stuff for a really long time, right? And 2, this is a practice that we now call public sociology. This was not a term that we had back then. This was something that was brought up in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But this idea of bridging the gap between all this academic, sciencey stuff over here and everyone else over here, and to try to get the science and academic stuff out from the ivory tower up here and into the public. A question that I often ask my students in many of my classes is, if you're a student or you're somehow connected to the university, you have access to this massive library. And with this massive library is access to thousands and thousands of journal articles, right? Of which no one reads, even though we tell you to read that stuff, right? Anyone want to take a stab at how much just a yearly subscription is to a academic journal? If you didn't have access to that university? Say it again?
$170,000 a year.
Oh my God, I hope not. No. There's a range, there's a significant range, but it can be a couple thousand, right? Was that your guess? Yeah, it could be a couple thousand. So this is a pretty sizable gap. This is a pretty sizable question of accessibility to who has access to good information. And that's a pretty contemporary problem that we're talking about today. And so there's a way, in other words, to get to the public this good information that kind of bypasses the normal academic route. And these were tactics that these early sociologists were playing around with at the time. I would also point out that's kind of the premise to a community lecture series like this as well, right? You're welcome. All right. This is just a quote from the book that, again, gets to the premise of that interaction between the 2 protagonists. Okay. Flip the circle, or flip the flow here in a little bit. We've been talking about sociologists, classically trained sociologists dabbling in science fiction, but the reverse is true as well. We're all kind of familiar with H.G. Wells, pretty noted science fiction writer. So you've got The Time Machine and War of the Worlds and so forth. There you are. He also dabbled a little bit into social science as well. And so he wrote kind of his nonfiction piece on the New World Order, which more or less envisions, I'll put up a quote there, which more or less envisions what our planet could look like if we all worked together. Wouldn't that be lovely, right? If we all worked together. And this was, he's writing shortly, a little bit after World War I, so right kind of at the cusp of World War II. And this work, this body of work was heavily inspirational to post-World War development of the UN. And so many of the designers of the UN pointed to a lot of the work and a lot of the ideas from H.G. Wells's text here as raising some really good questions on what that would actually look like, right? So kind of flipping the flow here, as I mentioned, where we get to see how science fiction contributes a little bit maybe to the social sciences as well. Okay, today. So this is all work that was done, 200 years, 100 years ago, and so forth, but the same type of work is being done today. As I mentioned, this idea of public sociology has really taken off over the last couple of decades. You start to see the development of things like podcasts and blogs that try to get science out there to the consumption of the masses and so forth. But as we think about it in terms of science fiction, I'll point to just one example. Octavias Brood is an anthology of science fiction stories, short stories, and poems that are written by a number of authors in memorial to Octavia Butler, who was a pretty noted science fiction author in the latter half of the 20th century, who wrote a lot about race and class and sexuality, kind of these taboo areas even in science fiction, and she was able to open up a lot of those conversations there. And so I'm going to bring up one short story, one example that was written by Adrienne Marie Brown. But Brown offers a really good example and a good template for what the book is really about. So the authors, all the contributors to this particular anthology are all either social scientists, social activists, educators, maybe social organizers for particular social movements that are looking specifically at marginalized populations or issues that are related. And the river, as one example, and I'll read a quote from the story in just a second. But the river takes place in Detroit, and it envisions basically the aftermath of some of the consequences related to climate change, where the water levels have increased, and so many of the waterways of Detroit have basically overtaken much of the city, pushing out many of the white inhabitants. And it envisions kind of a few years later where prices and the cost of living has decreased substantially throughout Detroit. Is this sounding familiar at all? And this has encouraged many white entrepreneurs to come back to buy up and to find a kind of a chance, so to speak, at creating a new life for themselves and new businesses and so forth. We have a term for this. Anyone know what that term is? Nicely done, right. So she plays a lot with not only the role of climate change at really kind of redrafting and recreating our social landscape as well as our natural landscape, but looking at issues related to urban gentrification and resources and environment. So this story borders not only the speculative fiction, but a little bit of horror too, because the river is actually a living organism, and it quite directly eats up all of these new incoming white populations. So it's got a vendetta, in other words. I'll read in response the protagonist, who is someone that would give tours to a lot of the primarily white, affluent tourists coming into Detroit to explore the city and maybe possibly look at land and places to buy. And in reflection of what's kind of happening, she states, she tried for years to keep an open heart to new folks, most of them white. The city needed people to live in it and job creation, right? And some of these new folks seemed really to care. But it could harden her heart a little each day to see people showing up all the time with jobs or making new work for themselves and their friends. White folks born and raised here couldn't make a living, or wild folks rather, born and raised here couldn't make a living, couldn't get investors for business. She heard entrepreneurs on the news speak of Detroit as this exciting new blank canvas. She wondered if new folks just couldn't see all the people there, the signs everywhere that there was history and there was people living here all over that supposed blank canvas. And it gets to a lot of the issues related to gentrification, where we know that often as a consequence is the dislocation of the original inhabitants that are experiencing that. I would also offer a quick note on the symbolism of water for this story, especially in this area, including, if you don't go too much farther outside of Detroit, you hit Flint, which at the same time that this story was written is still dealing with the water crisis. And so what Brown has done is taken a symbol or the imagery of water that historically at this conjunction and in this area was a sign of oppression, and kind of flips that into a sign and symbol of empowerment, which is pretty important. Both of this body of work, and then when we think of Du Bois as being the precursor to this is what we call Afrofuturism. And Afrofuturism is a form of black speculative fiction. This idea of the use of science fiction to say something critically about race in our society and class and sex and other kind of marginalizing populations that we otherwise don't necessarily hear. Okay, I'm good. So that gives me to an area in science fiction that I thought we could explore a little bit more on, which is what we call alternative history or alternative or speculative fiction. So far, a lot of the stories, a lot of the examples that I've identified are kind of these what-if scenarios into the future, but there's a whole body of work that we can look at which takes us retroactively back into the past and envision what an alternative history could look like. And that's becoming a very popular subgenre today as well. So For All Mankind is an example of this. Anyone watching For All Mankind? Oh, they may not be around for a second season. What? All right, there you go. What's For All Mankind about?
Don't listen to the critics. They don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
It's so cool. It's I don't usually go for alternative histories.
Yeah.
But it's very cool. What they've done is they said, what if the Russians beat us to the moon? And further than that, that alone would have been an interesting premise. But then they said, what if the first cosmonaut on the moon wasn't even a man, but a woman?
Yeah.
And what would that do to the space program? And what would that do to the identities of the people involved? So
Yeah.
it's a very interesting and frankly, I think, very well scripted and well shot.
Sounds like you got paid for that one. So maybe Susan, season 2 is in the mix there. Okay. Yeah, so it's basically the speculation if one or two things change, how that can provide maybe this domino effect in really redrafting our social landscape leading up to it. I was having a conversation before the talk started on the show Watchmen, which again is another version of speculative history. Again, there's a number of different adaptations of that graphic novel as well. One of the examples that I wanted to play around with today, it sounds like there are more viewers of The Man in the High Castle, which was originally a short story by Philip K. Dick that really explores this what-if question about the result of World War II, if it had ended slightly differently. And so there's a lot going on with this story, as you can imagine. If the present-day United States gets split up between Nazi Germany and Japan, but really at the core, it's dealing with some pretty big questions about nationalism and xenophobia. In other words, attitudes about the other, or attitudes about kind of the demonized minority group or other group outside of our own in-group. And these themes are pretty poignant as we consider our own social and political climate today, as we're kind of inundated with lots of headlines about right-wing extremist groups and neo-Nazis and so forth. Part of my own personal research in dealing with things like nationalism and religious nationalism looks at metrics like trust in others around us. So if we look at I know, it's okay, we'll get through it. The first stat is from the General Socialist Survey that's been tracking some of these questions for the better part of 30 or 40 years. Our general trust in others haven't really changed all that much for the last 30 years, which is kind of staggering on its own that we're only bordering around a third who would really trust others in a general sense. And if you kind of break that down, Here I'm pulling from a different survey. But if you break that down into different types of groups, you can start to see how those differences play out. So just within the course of the last, within 5 years, so we don't have any more recent data from this survey program at least, since 2014. But I think we can all safely assume that it probably hasn't gotten that much better, is a pretty significant decline, about 10 points in each variable, in each metric. So these ideas, or this use of science fiction of speculative history, kind of these what-if scenarios of what a history could have looked like, is a really great playground, a really great platform for us to play around with some of the ideas and themes that we're experiencing right now, right? All right, so keeping in line with this, I'll take kind of a different turn here to focus on an even nichier. I'm bringing you into my nerd universe more and more. So bear with me. But steampunk is another kind of form of alternative or speculative history as well. Some of us might be more familiar with it than others. So just kind of a quick definition. There's not really a general consensus of what it's about, but typically this is literary, some film, some TV, some music and art as well. There's a whole do-it-yourself culture that's related to steampunk too. But the general idea is kind of reinventing history. Oftentimes it's focusing on the Victorian historical setting that looks at energy in a very different way and thinks about the advancements of usually steam, thus the name, of steam-based power machinery as it advancing to the levels that we're largely familiar with today. So you've got computing devices, for example, that are powered by steam. So this is a whole genre that deals a lot with questions about technology and the impact that technology has on society today. So, as is true with many versions of science fiction and fantasy, this is a form that attempts to punk or turn over conventional norms about all of these social conventions, right? Disability, gender, technology, the human condition, and so forth. The example that I have for us is actually takes us back a little bit. And this is I'm going to share in just a moment the lyrics to an old English kind of pub ballad. I'll be actually asking one of you to sing it for all. No, I'm just kidding. That dates back to, there's some question over when exactly because it's a pub ballad, but by probably around the 1830s or so. And this is kind of one of the very first versions of steampunk before steampunk was even a thing. It's been adapted in a lot of more contemporary versions of steampunk. But basically, if you want to take a moment, I don't think I have too much time to have us go through it, maybe individual or alone, but basically the gist of the story is an individual had gone to war and lost his arm, and in coming home he experienced some difficulties at work because of his disability. He was getting paid less for the same work that he was otherwise doing, but now because of his status as being disabled, that this was kind of a consequence. There's a whole lot going on with gender here, especially if you read that first line here, men can do whatever they please. We go on to see that he saves his money, spends his money on a steam-powered prosthetic, which becomes quite powerful, and he uses that to his advantage. So kind of the use of technology to increase his status at work. He's able to earn better money and increase a better wage because of that. He's also able to increase his own masculine pride back at home. And if you get to that certain point, and then maybe I should have offered a quick trigger warning, he kills his wife, and then when the police come, he kills all the police too. I know this is kind of a merging of a lot of different genres here, but he goes on to basically argue as he is in the courts and as he's being questioned by a judge and then in prison and then escapes that prison and then is on the loose. He more or less develops this kind of Frankensteinian sense that the arm is controlling his violence, right? And I bring this particular story up, this song up, because it brings out a lot of different themes that we've already been talking about. Some questions about gender, some questions about class. The status of disability is a really important area in steampunk, as a theme, that kind of a trope that gets carried out a lot in that genre. But as we think about, especially today, our conversations and our debates about gun control and the notion and the perspective of guns as being tools, or the blame of violence, or the person pulling the trigger, that all gets played out in that same story as well, which is very similar to Frankenstein's monster as well. So in other words, is it the arm that did the violence, or was it the person behind the arm, for example, right? And so I think I kind of played with a couple of those already. Yeah, so we talked a little bit about some of those themes. And then as kind of my final wrap up here, as we think about really the role of technology as being an important piece to this form of alternative speculation and alternative history making, is the role that automation and sometimes we use the term biohacking, in other words, the use of technology to enhance our human form, plays out with identity. And this is a very typical question and conversation that we see in a lot of steampunk work, how technology is impacting new meanings on identity and our sense of self. There's a lot of work in psychology and social psychology and so forth that for decades now have been tracking, how we are potentially developing a new sense of self as a result of, as a consequence to our virtual communication, the way that we interact online, the way that we present ourselves potentially different online than we do in physical face-to-face interactions. There's an interesting study that Pew put out a couple years ago that identified, regardless of kind of who you are, everyone's doing a little bit of trolling. In other words, we're not really creating or putting out our best selves online than we might if we were actually engaging with people face-to-face. This idea, I'll bring up both of those separately, this idea that we are kind of creating two different selves out of one, potentially kind of one body, is not new in science fiction and in fantasy. The same ideas are seen in The Matrix, which I think a lot of us are familiar with. The book Ready Player One, which was also eventually turned into a film, also plays out this idea that one person can have kind of two different bodily forms, the physical body and the virtual body. So you have one consciousness, in other words, inhabiting different bodies, is in many ways the exact opposite of what Du Bois was talking about with two-ness. Whereas two-ness for Du Bois was this idea of one body with two identities, two different selves. Now we're exploring these ideas because of technology, because of virtual avatars and so forth. This notion that one consciousness can have potentially two bodily forms, one physical and one virtual, and how that can potentially have some interesting consequences with our sense of identity, our sense of self, and the ways that we interact and engage with one another too. So we had some technical difficulties related to the sound. I had a final clip here, so I'm just going to have to bear with me, and I'm just going to kind of describe it to you. If you really want the link, hit me up afterwards, and I'll give you the link. You can also probably just Google it, because yay, technology. But the clip I had was a cafe that over the last couple of years was being developed by some engineers in Japan. And it kind of starts off with this idea that robots in cafes in Japan is not really a new thing anymore. That's kind of like pretty normalized at this point. But what makes this cafe particularly unique is that the robots themselves are actually avatars for other humans who, for whatever reason, are unable to interact or either emotionally or oftentimes physically within a work environment. Oftentimes, these are individuals. There's a larger example of this with the population of ALS patients who are using avatars as a way to earn money and to work. This, which would have otherwise been a pretty significant challenge and obstacle for those individuals dealing with that disability. So here you have this kind of illustration of the use of technology to develop an entirely new body for someone that would open up the opportunity to engage with the wider world and to earn money, to work, to relate and interact with others in a way that we otherwise would not be able to do. So there are a lot of conversations about biohacking, the consequences of biohacking like this, or the consequences of automating our work into something that's more technological, and there's usually these large questions on whether or not we're seeing a loss of jobs because of it, but there are also some pretty interesting opportunities that we see within the example here as well. So I know that I've got just like a minute or two to kind of wrap up, and I had to pop in my Doctor Who reference somewhere, but I guess I would just, as a way to kind of bring everything together, offer this one thought, this one reflective piece, which is, I think, one of the interesting, kind of fascinating, and really intriguing results of the blend of science fiction and the social sciences together is really the creation of creative and innovative thinking. We have learned in kind of almost regardless of the science, regardless of the discipline, that we need to kind of buckle down in our own silo disciplines, and that sociology shouldn't touch psychology over there in the corner, or econ over here, right? And that we all kind of claim our own space and our own work, but that we actually have a history of a lot of interesting collaboration across a lot of different lines. And this is work that we've been doing, like I said, since the beginning of our discipline. Whether it was acknowledged is a whole other question, but it is still something that we've been doing. And then I would go back to this piece that I started with, which is really bridging that gap between good data, good information about who we are as people in society, and how we get that out there to an accessible format. Well, again, what we call public sociology, and that those were concerns that we've been grappling with for 100 plus years. So with that, I will stop, and then I know we've got maybe 15 minutes or so for questions or thoughts. There's a lot of science fiction out there, and I don't claim to know even like a quarter of it. So maybe you can share some of your thoughts on your own passions, your own interests, and how that speaks to what's going on in society today too. Unless anyone would like to take a stab at singing that ballad. Yeah.
Can you speak to how science fiction, tends to go in cycles of like varying levels of bleakness in its view of the future, and specifically with reference to like cyberpunk, which kind of came about in I think the late 80s, early 90s.
Late 80s.
And then kind of feels like some of those aspects are coming true today. Do you feel like the can you just speak to like I'm sorry, excuse me.
No, you're fine. My answer is yes. It's in some ways the foundation of science fiction is always going to be overtly critical, because it is taking a sense of the status quo and trying to envision something different, right? And so there's always, I would argue that there's always going to be a sense of not necessarily negative, but a real critical look at who we are now, or who we are potentially going to be, or we've talked a little bit about the speculative history stuff too. In other words, maybe re-envisioning what we thought was amazing and really turning that up on its head. A lot of steampunk deals with what we would now call post-colonialist and kind of imperialist, post-imperialistic themes that, especially for much of Western Europe, who was doing a lot of the colonizing, a lot of the throughout the rest of the world, largely ordained that as being a movement toward what a modern society, a modern world would look like. And what a lot of steampunk literature and stories do is to more critically envision what that level of imperialism has really done to the psyche of, say, of Africa, for example, or of India and so forth. So I would argue that while there, certain types of science fiction may come across as less bleak than others, there should always be a good sense of criticism in any form. It should all be bleak. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
So I know earlier in your presentation you briefly touched on how we're moving towards the opposite of two-ness and having one mind and maybe two different physical identities. Yeah. And I know you had briefly said that there might be some consequences to come to the future. I was just wondering, like, what the field that you work in, what the overall opinion is. Is there a possibility that there could be benefits to this upcoming virtual reality in the future, or more just a negative?
I mean, robots will destroy us all, but no. It's interesting, and I will speak on behalf of kind of sociology specifically, right? But if you were to have asked that question 20 years ago, so a few years after the internet where everyone was freaking out, the overall message would be quite suspicious, that this is changing the way that humans interact with one another, and it's not for the good. It's worse than kids watching TV, and all of that kind of public fear about it. But today, I won't go as far as to say that there's a consensus here, but that there is less of this kind of stark fear and negativity toward it. Yes, we know that access to screen time, depending on age, can have some pretty significant and not so great outcomes that we should be pretty mindful of as educators and parents and so forth. On the other hand, this kind of ability to interact with others instantaneously across the entire world opens up some opportunities that as humans we've never had before. So if you grow up in a small town in Wisconsin and you think you're the only person that thinks this way or feels this way, and you don't have access to any other community that is similar to you, well, before the internet, you were stuck with some pretty serious dilemmas there, but now you have the ability to access a community. So there's a lot of really interesting opportunities. So I won't claim that there's a consensus there, but we certainly acknowledge that there's a lot of complexity to that. Mm-hmm.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because throughout this I'm thinking that there's this divide right now between access to these things.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned small town, rural Wisconsin. Most small towns in rural Wisconsin don't have very good internet.
Mm-hmm.
And now, smartphones are becoming, more and more prevalent. Mm-hmm. So people are beginning to have that as access. But where I live, honestly, I know people who can't understand how I can live there. I still have DSL.
What is that? No, I'm just kidding.
But I mean, it's just, and that's one of those things that I'm hoping that when you're talking about these things, that divide needs to be evened out, or it'll just get greater.
Yeah. So we actually call that phenomena the digital divide, and that it is closing, which is a good thing, largely due to our hardware becoming smaller and smaller. So you're no longer having to get the Tandy 1000. Do you remember the Tandy 1000s? Yeah, I know. And now you have everything literally at your fingertips, and it's becoming a lot more accessible. But that digital divide still certainly does exist, and even though it is closing. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. I feel like there was a question in the back. I could be making it up. Yeah.
Yeah, so, recently they've had a lot of controversy about the Nebula Awards, and who's getting awarded these, which is precisely about this idea of two-ness, right?
Yeah.
That people are taking these sociological concepts and talking about identity and race and class and gender. There's been a real backlash against it from some of the, I guess you would call them the old school. They want these heroic tales of men going off and exploring space as if it's the new frontier and these other kinds of things, right? So a lot of it is really subversive but controversial within the community. So I wonder if you could say more about maybe some of those debates and the subversiveness of a lot of this science fiction, because it is so much about us today rather than the future.
Well, yeah, and let's be honest, much of, especially in the United States, much of science fiction and fantasy writing are written by white male authors, right? And that's something that I had that reference to Octavia Butler, who was a pretty powerful writer during the 1970s and beyond, because she added this very different perspective to a genre in fiction that was heavily predominant by white males. But since then, that has, and largely due to the work and fame from Butler, that has opened this kind of door to other authors of color and other marginalized groups to be kind of added to that mix. And that has in many ways kind of re-exploded science fiction and fantasy, because it's not telling the same stories that it always has, and a lot of the fame that comes from that might be looked at, as you said, from the old guard as being threatening. I guess I can't speak necessarily to the reasons beyond, I think, the assumption that the status quo wants to keep the status quo, so to speak. But the fact that science fiction, that there's just a much larger proportion of science fiction and fantasy work that's being written and being transmitted by otherwise marginalized groups. And so there is kind of a backlash that we see in a lot of these different institutions. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
Can I comment on?
Yeah.
Part of the irony of that is that science fiction has always been the genre of the subversive. And
Yeah.
so what you're talking about is who are the ones who are defining what the genre is. And as more different people come in, it's not largely predominantly old white men now who are doing it. It's so many different kinds of people, and they're having an infinite fight over who's going to define what the identity of science fiction is. Hence what happened with the Hugos and
That's Hugo, yeah.
Disaster. But I think for me, I was glad to see it happening.
Yeah.
Because people are saying, here's what I want the genre to be.
Mm-hmm.
If you want it to be that genre, then get involved. And write the damn stuff. You know? And I think it galvanized a lot of people, the old guard, who write some really awesome stuff, and the new guard, who are from actually many different groups. And I think it helped to show that. And in another 30 or 40 years, the same thing will happen again. Because people who are reading it and writing it are always shifting, because it is the genre, the subversive and the social.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? I don't know. Because we have 5 minutes. Yeah.
I just sort of a funny kind of comment. I like to look at Star Wars from a sociological perspective.
I decided not to open up that Pandoras Box, but yeah. Yeah.
So I just find it awesome that in one of Star Wars movies, the more recent ones, there's a character who is pansexual, who is gender fluid, and actually has relationships with not only different species, but one of the droids, and they have a relationship. I think like Star Wars, one of the most popular, huge things owned by Disney.
I was going to say owned by Disney.
Extremely popular.
Yeah.
And then here's this relationship running between a droid and a sort of queer pansexual individual, and I think that's amazing. And actually, I like Star Wars for those reasons.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting example. How much time do we have? All right, we can do this in 2 minutes. So this genre has always, as you mentioned, always attempts to kind of push the envelope, so to speak, by asking really big questions, controversial questions, including controversial characters and so forth. It's always kind of rubbed that fine line between tokenism on the one hand, so it just including a character that is diverse for the sake of diversity versus actually including that character as potentially like a protagonist, for example, as a key character. What Disney's doing with Star Wars right now is there's a lot of debate in terms of what that overall intention necessarily is. But I know I told you I opened up Pandora's Box with that one. We only have a minute. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to ask you this question. What is the future to social science? I mean, the social sciences, with, our consciousness of reality and all this. Where are we going?
I got 1 minute. I'll answer it this way. I think that what's really exciting is that our discipline, at least in the United States, because every version of our discipline globally has different takes on this, but in the United States at least, our discipline is willing to incorporate directly science fiction as a useful area and environment to play out some of our ideas. Here, this is what I'll send you off with. Starting in the early 2000s, 2006, 2008, and now I can only say this because I have tenure too. 2006, 2007 is the development of a niche area called Astro Sociology, which is basically the allowance for social scientists to ask big questions about what happens when we meet ET. Right? I know, I'm really nerding out on you at this point. Because the argument is that other sciences are already have been doing it for a really long time. Astronomy certainly has been asking those types of questions. In some capacity, physics has been, a lot of the natural sciences have, but the social sciences are way behind at truly asking big questions about basically anything extraterrestrial. And so what happens when we do create a space colony? Well, we already have a colony in the International Space Station, but there's been very little social science to really explore what the human relations, the form of identity has. How many of you are familiar with the twin study that NASA did a couple years ago? Put one twin up into the station and then one down here. Anyone have siblings would probably love that dynamic. And to study not just the physiological differences, right, but the psychological and the emotional differences. That was one of the very first of its kind, and we've been, throwing people up into space for the better part of half a century. So we are in a place now where, at least in sociology, we're really kind of willing to ask some of those what would otherwise been kind of fringy questions, and sometimes still are, which is why I waited until I got tenure to start talking about this stuff, to start asking that now. So I'm hopeful that the blending of these areas and these disciplines will continue to collaborate more and more. And maybe that's a good way to end it. Yeah.